This podcast is supported by Pentax Medical. Now, welcome back to our weekly endoscopy podcast. My name is Björn Rembacken. I'm a gastroenterologist and endoscopist in Leeds. Today, Nick Burr and I are talking to Matt Rutter, Professor of Gastroenterology at North Tees, about the National Endoscopy Database. For those of you who don't work in the UK National Health Service, let me explain. The National Endoscopy Database, or NED for short, is an automated system to collate the core facts of all endoscopies carried out every minute of the day onto a central database. I think I know what you're thinking. How can a country who can't agree with its friends and partners in Europe agree to share and collaborate like this? After all, there are about 2 million endoscopies carried out every year in the UK. And imagine the findings of all these examinations collated onto a central database. Now, in a few years' time, this dataset will contain details of millions of diagnostic and therapeutic procedures. And not just those done in ivory towers, but every endoscopy, whether it's done in a small private center or a large university hospital. And furthermore, this data is real time, is never more than 60 minutes old. Now, if anyone knows what information we may glean from this dataset, which will no doubt be the largest endoscopy dataset in the world, is Matt Rutter. First, I asked him when and why was it decided to try to set this system up.
The National Endoscopy Database is something that we conceived, I think it was as far back as 2013. We just realised that with the NHS being a network, there was an opportunity really to pool that data for the good of all of us, including patients, of course. And so we set about creating this single national database to capture data from every hospital's endoscopy reporting system. And we work with the industry, and they've changed their systems to produce a data output from the back end of their systems, which is sucked through onto the national database. And all of this is an automated process. And I guess really at the outset, there were 4 main aims for setting this up. Firstly, quality assurance. There was an increasing awareness that there was a range of quality in endoscopy and that had really important outcomes for patients. We know that poor quality colonoscopy misses cancers and patients die of that, for example. And everybody had been working hard, doing a lot of work in their local hospital, trying to pull together their own data. But it just made a lot more sense to do that nationally, to remove the need for every hospital to do that piece of work. We could do it all for them in a standardized way across the UK. So quality assurance and quality improvement were the first aims. Beyond that, we also appreciated that with large data, there's great potential to understand more about how things work endoscopically across the UK. We have surprisingly little insight into who does what, for example. And this would allow us to open up that black box, if you like, and see who's doing what, look at the yield from certain indications, to try to evaluate our service and improve our service and give us some intelligence about what's happening in UK endoscopy. So service evaluation and intelligence, I guess, were the second strand. The third strand really evolves from that, which is pure research. We know the potential for research with large data sets, and we wanted to have the opportunity to exploit that for the good of UK endoscopy and for our patients. And then finally, to do with endoscopy training. So the JETS training database had been in existence for longer. But that involved trainees having to double enter data. So they would do the endoscopy report, but then essentially they would duplicate that data on the JETS website. So we wanted to remove that duplication and pull the data directly from their local system, so that it all aligned with JETS and make it easier for endoscopists. So I guess they were the four aims, and I think we're well on the way to achieving most, if not all, of those goals. At the moment, we think there's just over 500 endoscopy units in the United Kingdom, and 421, I checked this morning, of those units are actively uploading to the National Endoscopy Database. And we now have over 3 million endoscopic procedures recorded on the database. So it's over 1 million gastroscopies, over 1 million colonoscopies, probably about 700,000 flexible sigmoidoscopies, and a smaller number of ERCPs. We're not capturing ERCP from all of those hospitals yet. At the outset, we had a better understanding of what the data requirements were for colonoscopy and gastroscopy and sigmoidoscopy, so we focused on those. So the ERCP aspect was non-mandatory. I think we have about 60,000 ERCPs, so it's still a decent number. But as we move to the second iteration of NED, we're going to correct that. So we're going to have mandatory ERCP upload and endoscopic ultrasound as well. So things will improve further in due course.
I mean, it all sounds fantastic, and to us the benefits of this are really clear. It's going to be an absolutely amazing resource. When do you think the timeline will be to get everybody online and uploading, and do you think that's achievable?
So I think it is achievable. We've seen adoption as you'd expect, so that you've got your standard adoption curve where there's a small number of units who want to get going straight away, and then it gains momentum, and then you get over 50-60%, and then it starts to slow down beyond that point. You have the adoption laggards who are, for whatever reason, logistical or from many other reasons why some units might not have adopted so far. But we're over 80% across the UK, and actually in England it's higher than that still. So we will get there, and I guess although it's non-mandatory in its own right, we have aligned it to JAG GRS standards. So through the JAG process, it's a mandatory GRS requirement to be uploading. So that gives some weight behind it. And more what we're finding actually is that other organisations are very, very keen to ensure that that every centre is uploading. So NHS England, for example, are pushing very hard across England to have all of their units uploading, and we've had discussions with Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, and again they're very keen to be able to access their data and therefore to have their centres uploading. So yeah, I think we will get there. I guess that it's not a major part of my role. I guess I see my remit is having NED available and making it easy for people to upload and guiding them through that process. But I'm not the enforcer of this. I'll leave that to JAG and to others.
So who will be doing the data processing and analysis behind the scenes, Matt, to look at discrepancies in practices across the country?
So from the outset, we wanted to make sure that this data was available to the right people. So there are hierarchies of data access. Endoscopists can all log in and access their own data, and we know many endoscopists do that regularly. So they have access to their own data in a standardized format, and the system automatically calculates KPIs for them, and there are funnel plots, so you can see yourself against anonymized other dots on that plot. So from an endoscopist point of view, that as long as your hospital is uploading, then you already have access to that. From a trust perspective, likewise, the trust endoscopy leads can access and can see the named data of all of their endoscopists in that unit. So that we know it again is being used quite a lot, and you can download that data, so you can email that to your the colleagues within your trust and so on. Outside of trusts, nobody can see endoscopist named data. It's anonymized from an endoscopist perspective, but JAG, for example, can access hospital level data, so they can see that. But if they wanted to pick up any underperformance, they would have to liaise with the trust to have that discussion. So there's a hierarchy of access. In addition, what we want to do is to exploit the data to its fullest potential, so people can apply for access to that data. Again, that's endoscopist and hospital anonymized data, but there's an application process through the JAG Research Committee, and that's reviewed by the Independent Research Committee, and in a similar way to if you were applying for bowel cancer screening data, for example, there's a similar sort of process that we have for NED data. And that's in evolution. So we've been quite cautious at the outset, and we're still in the process of validating some of the data to make sure that it is all fit for purpose. So we've been cautious about not giving the data out too freely. We want it to be established academics who understand the potential limitations of the data, and we're working with them just to make sure that, as I say, it is all fit for purpose. But next year we're moving to the second iteration of NED, which tightens data definitions for things like indications and diagnoses. So we're standardizing the terminology there, and that should make it a much richer data set. And we hope that more and more people will apply to use that data for the good of UK endoscopy.
And do you think there's anywhere in the world that can compete with us with anything like this? It looks like we're really leading the way on this kind of big data openness and being able to report nationally. Do you think we are the envy of the world with this?
I think we are, Nick, actually, yes. And I know from having discussions with colleagues from around the world that other nations are quite keen to learn from us, or even to join NED, so they can add their own nation's data to NED. We're having to focus on making sure we get it absolutely right before we expand beyond the UK. Yeah. But potentially there's no reason why we can't. To my knowledge, there's only one other nation that at a similar time actually has been developing a similar national database, and that's Japan. I haven't discussed that with the Japanese team for a few years now, actually, so I don't know how widespread that the Japanese system has been used. But that's the only other automated capture of national endoscopy database data that I'm aware of. There are a few other databases out there. There's one in the United States, for example, where you can double enter data onto a separate data set. But again, that doesn't have national coverage. So no, I think we're in a very strong position, and yeah, it'd be lovely to continue to lead the pack.
Yeah.
Do you think that countries will accept our data? I have visions of say the Spanish rejecting it as not really relevant to their practice, or the Germans. We do things differently over here. The Brits, they have a different data capture, doesn't really apply to us, and we have no plans to make up our own. The reason I'm asking is because there's very few studies of, for example, cecal intubation rates and stuff like that across communities in all practices. It tends to come from ivory towers and small networks. But nationwide, there's very few big studies looking at all the data from the big centers and the small centers to say, actually, the cecal intubation rate in the smaller centers is this, and in the big centers is that. So it seems to me, as an outsider, that there seems to be an inbuilt resistance. It may be a structural problem in some countries from accepting a big overarching entry system.
I think that's true, Bjorn, to some extent. I think there's always a fear, isn't there? When you're publishing your own data. But I think more and more nations, I think that people have seen what's happened in UK endoscopy over the last 20 years, really since the first BSG national audit by Bowles that was published, that showed how terrible our cecal intubation rate was, and other performance metrics too. And I think others were, acknowledged how brave that was to publish that, but have also seen what's happened in terms of improving the quality that's resulted from that. And certainly the discussions I've had, I chaired the ESG Quality Improvement Committee, and many nations and individuals were coming to us saying we're really keen to be able to identify what our performance is, both locally and nationally, because we want to have that palliative care for our patients, of course, and we've seen what's happened in the UK, and we'd like to replicate that. So I think for the enlightened, data and performance data can be used for the greater good, but it's a brave step, isn't it? It's much easier just to carry on doing what you're doing and not have anyone being able to oversee what you're doing. But I think if that's handled sensitively, then everyone only has things to gain from this, really.
Yeah. I think some of the graphical representation, like the funnel plots of some of these data that are fed back to trusts, and then to see national anonymised data about outliers, is just fantastic to get that data quickly, real time, to just see where people sit on the graph, and a real carrot for people to see what other people are doing and where the benchmark should be, really. So I think to be able to get that data very quickly is just a really good asset to this database.
I'd agree, Nick, and I guess the pandemic has really shown the benefit of that. NHS England, for example, captures data on endoscopy through the HES data, but a lot of that works many months behind, so the data is not accessible in the week that the procedures were done, and that's been very, very challenging for NHS England to therefore see what's actually happening day to day, week to week, as we've tried to recover from the impact of the pandemic. So that's why these organisations have been turning to NED, where the data is uploaded. Essentially, when you print out your report, the data gets uploaded and it's refreshed every hour. So this is real time and immediate data, and that's been hugely useful to identify the issues that we've had, and to map out the recovery, the early and medium term recovery that UK endoscopy's gone through from the pandemic.
Yeah. You touched on it a bit earlier, but certainly from my perspective, a trainee perspective, having to dual enter information at the moment onto the JET system can be incredibly laborious, and I don't think is done that accurately. I'm not speaking personally there. But how quickly do you think we'll be able to transition to use NED for accreditation and training?
Well, surprisingly, Nick, this has been perhaps the most challenging part of the development of NED. It's fairly easy to capture data on diagnoses, indications, sedation use, etc. But the relationship between the trainee and the trainer, who did what? When did the trainer take over? Was it during intubation? Was it during extubation? That's far more challenging. And that's the bit that the endoscopy reporting system companies have struggled the most with. And some have come up with very elegant solutions to that. Others, the solutions have been somewhat clunky. But just to say that, it is perfectly possible, once the system has been redesigned, your local system has been redesigned to capture all that data in a very effortless way. So, if your local system isn't doing that, if it is a very clunky system, then perhaps you should be looking at some of the other systems where the solutions are better. So to answer your question, well, one company has fully integrated with JET. So for hospitals that are using that system, that's already happening. So they're not having to double enter data. The other companies are, I know, working very hard to create effortless solutions for that. And we're in the process of moving to the second iteration of NED, as I mentioned. And we've set the companies a deadline to have their systems up and running and have piloted those in a single hospital over 3 months and completed that piloting by early summer next year. So we hope that all the other systems will have ticked that box and have that permanent JET solution by then. But I guess that's in the hands of the companies.
Endoscopy is only one system in the National Health Service, isn't it? Are there any talks of, say, the cardiologists kind of doing something similar, or the respiratory physicians? You would have thought there'd be an opening in other specialties to do something different when central processing of large data could be beneficial. Renal medicine, the more you think about it, the more you think actually others could do the same. Or is endoscopy leading the way entirely, as far as you know?
So there are other audit systems out there. So, for example, in orthopedics, they've got joint replacement registries. But my understanding is that, again, that needs double entry of data, which I think is done pretty reliably because they see the importance of that. So there are national systems, but automated capture of data, I'm not so sure about, to be honest, Bjorn. You clearly need to have a local electronic system. So, I mean, clearly what we're doing with NED, could be translated into other spheres. And we have had some early discussions with, the respiratory colleagues, for example. Obviously they do endoscopic work as well. So that will be the closest analogy or expansion of NED, if you like. And we're currently having discussions about whether we can expand this to capture capsule endoscopy, for example, and as our range of GI tools increase, potentially we can use the same mechanism for capturing that data too. So I think there's a huge potential to expand this beyond standard GI endoscopy.
And how about linking with our data sets? you can't go to a conference nowadays without hearing about artificial intelligence, which will feed into the endoscopy reporting, of course. AI will probably tell you how many blind spots you ignored, how many potential polyps you didn't look at twice, how many times you didn't retrovert in the rectum, and maybe can one day also measure the extubation time, etc. So there are other data sets there. I know, Nick, you know the cancer data set. Is there any way of linking other data sets into NED3?
So there is, and certainly in terms of additional endoscopic data points. So, for example, you're saying about artificial intelligence. So it may well be that generates new endoscopic data sets. That's fairly easy for us to incorporate. You know, we can just mandate additional data fields and add to NED. So that's fairly straightforward. And then there's the second challenge with linking with other data sets, cancer registry, for example. The challenge that we have there is that you need to have patient identifiers. You need to have a way of linking. And for pragmatic reasons, we decided at the outset that at least in the first iteration of NED, we would not include patient identifiers. And that way we've avoided having to jump through a number of governance hurdles. But clearly, to really unlock the potential of NED, we do want and have always intended to add a patient identifier. And we're now in quite advanced discussions about doing that. NHS England, again, this is clearly for England, but I'm sure the devolved nations want to do the same. They're very keen for us to do that, because then we can start to, for example, evaluate technologies. So there's a lot of interest in a colon capsule at the moment. Well, it would be great if we could capture the colon capsule data on NED, and it would be great if we could then have follow-up data on which of those patients end up having a colonoscopy later down the line, or end up having a cancer detected down the line. So that's when you can really exploit the fullest potential of the data. So we're working on that, but that has lots of challenges, but we'll definitely get there eventually. As you say, that's probably NED iteration 3.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a no-brainer, and I'm sure there'd be buy-in from patients and providers and everyone into like that should be done. Why wouldn't it be done? So hopefully, get that resource. I mean,
the hope, one of the, I don't want NED to be a burden. It has to make everyone's lives easier. So you should be able to enter your data onto your local system without even realizing that it's being inputted into NED. If that's not the case, then that system isn't working properly. And in terms of capturing data for performance, again, NED should be doing that for you and presenting you with that data in a standardized format to make your lives easier. And when you start to link to other data sets, again, you can start to automate that and look at post-colonoscopy colorectal cancer rates in an automated way, so that you don't have to go through hundreds of hours of academic work trying to produce these figures. So that's the long-term goal. But anyone who's worked with data sets and trying to link data sets knows that it's remarkably challenging, but we will get there.
And what do you think what else would you like to see in NED 3, the next generation?
So I think one of the big opportunities is to do for colonoscopy, to do for ERCP and gastroscopy and endoscopic ultrasound what we've done for colonoscopy. So I think colonoscopies led the way in terms of quality assurance and quality improvement, I guess in part driven by the instigation of the screening program. So it'd be nice if we can start to use NED data to have similar metrics for gastroscopy. And as I say, we're increasing the data capture for ERCP, so there's huge potential there as well. So I'd like to even it out across the different endoscopic procedures. In terms of data richness, when we started, there was no standardized agreed terms, indications. There are a few pieces of work that have been done internationally, as you know. There's MST terminology. I know you've been involved in that, Bjorn. But it's so important when you're capturing data to have it captured in a standardized way. So one of the big pieces of work that we've done for the second iteration of NED was to go to BSG and the Association of Colour Proctology and August, and to ask their experts to compile for us a reasonable data dictionary, if you like, terms that we can use for indications and for diagnoses. And then what we've done is we've pushed out those libraries of terms to the endoscopy reporting system companies and asked them to use those terms, or at least to map their terms to those terms. So that should give us much, much better quality information. So in the current iteration of NED, about 40% of indications are categorized as other, which is clearly useless. That will be corrected, or at least we hope it will be corrected as we move to the next iteration. So it's things like that, and NED will continue to be an evolution. And again, we've sort of acknowledged this from the outset. NED I1 has been incredibly useful, as I've explained, but it's by no means perfect. NED I2 will be a lot better, but again, we'll move on to 3, 4, 5, and things will get better and better, and hopefully everyone's lives will get easier and easier as a result of that.
Is there a risk that you become a victim of your own success, and there'll be a point in the future when there's so much and such a rich data set that the service at JAG and JETS is just falling over? It can no longer cope with the massive amount of data, let alone process it. And you might then have the choice of maybe approaching Google to help you with the data crunching. I mean, big data set needs big service and big resources for analysis, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's true. I guess, it's those sort of challenges are ones that we've yet to face, but there's potential for that, certainly. When it comes to performance indicators, I'm very, very keen. I mean, obviously, as you know, I've done a lot of work on the performance side of things, and it's one of my real interests. But it's really important that we don't just measure things because we can. The metrics that we produce have to be clinically meaningful, and it's much better to have a small number of important metrics than just measure 1,000 things just because you've got that data. So we have to be mindful of that. We don't want to overload people with outputs from NED. I'd rather refine what we have than continually add to the outputs, to the standard outputs. But of course, having this rich data lends itself to to research, as we've talked about, and then maybe through through that research you can learn how to refine things further, or discover there's a better metric and change from metric A to metric B. I think that's an important principle that I like to try and stick to.
And that's the benefit, isn't it? Having rich data, up-to-date, timely data, that then you can see which indicators are useful as time goes on. It might be that adenoma detection rate was great 10 years ago, but now when everybody's up at 40%, it's not as useful, and whether you need to change, and you can just use the different indicators that come out of NED. And if you can link it to a hard outcome like cancer, then you can see which ones and which few might need to be concentrated on.
Nick, you're absolutely right, and I couldn't agree with that more. In fact, many of us are involved in one of our first research projects, which is called NED Apricot, and that's exactly what we've been looking at. Whether ADR is the right measure or whether there's a better measure of performance, and how those, the different candidate metrics map out to more meaningful, clinically meaningful outcome measures such as post-colonoscopy colorectal cancer rate. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons why adenoma detection rate probably isn't the future metric. We know that adenomas aren't the be-all and end-all now. Your ADR doesn't tell you about serrated polyp detection, and ADR is all or none. You find 1, you find 10, it's still only 1 tick on your ADR. So maybe we should be counting the total number of polyps rather than yes or no, did you find an adenoma in this procedure? So it's those pieces of work that I think will help us to find the right metrics to improve quality, to improve patient outcomes.
Now, thanks to Matt and Nick for this discussion, which I think lifts the veil on the future of data capture in endoscopy. Well, that concludes this week's podcast. I hope that you do subscribe, and will tune in again next Friday afternoon. Bye for now. This podcast was supported by Pentax Medical.